There are those who seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. There are those who seek knowledge to be known by others. That is vanity. There are those who seek knowledge in order to serve. That is love. Bernard of Clairvaux. Nestled into an unassuming neighborhood just north of Miami lies the oldest standing masonry structure in the Western Hemisphere. This ancient monastery, hidden among the oaks and banyans, is constructed of over 30,000 stones. It was reportedly first erected almost 900 years ago. But hang on, Miami was only first settled around 200 years ago. Florida was only quote-unquote discovered 500 years ago, with Columbus setting sail only 20 years prior. So how on earth is it that a 900-year-old Christian monastery came to be constructed here? The unlikely answer to this question will surely be met with both surprise and ridicule, justifiably so. To make things even more interesting, however, Saint Bernard de Clairvaux, for whom the church is named, was the founder of the infamous Knights Templar, an order who are themselves shrouded in mystery, myth, and scandal. And speaking of scandal, we find a familiar face once again tangled up in a mess that they had no business being involved in. All of this, and much more, is soon to be addressed as we together tour the magnificent ancient Spanish monastery. Now enjoy.
Welcome to Florida, baby.
Introducing Dr. Narco Longo.
We will be reading from SpanishMonastery.com, as well as MiamiAndBeaches.com. Construction of the monastery of Saint Bernard de Clairvaux was begun in the year 1133 AD in Sacramenia, near Segovia, in northern Spain. Completed 8 years later, in 1141, the monastery was dedicated to the Blessed Mother and was originally named the Monastery of Our Lady, Queen of the Angels. Upon the canonization of Bernard of Clairvaux in 1174, the monastery was renamed in his honor. A Cistercian monk and mystic, the founder and abbot of the Abbey of Clairvaux, Bernard was one of the most influential church leaders of his time. Cistercian monks occupied the monastery for nearly 700 years. The ancient Spanish monastery is a little piece of Spanish history, says Father Gregory Mansfield, curator of the ancient Spanish Monastery Museum and Gardens. Construction began in 1133 AD, almost 360 years before Columbus left Spain and arrived in the Americas. It took 8 years to complete. There are over 35,000 stones, some of which weigh 1.5 tons. While the monastery itself was completed in 1141 AD, making its cloister the oldest building in the Western Hemisphere, it changed ownership for many years after. After a social revolution in the 1830s, the monastery's cloisters were seized, sold, and converted into a granary and stable. In 1925, William Randolph Hearst illegally purchased the cloisters and the monastery's outbuildings. The structures were dismantled stone by stone, bound with protective hay, packed in more than 11,000 wooden crates, numbered for identification, and shipped to the United States. Soon after the shipment arrived, Hearst's financial problems forced most of his collection to be sold at auction. The massive crates remained in a warehouse in Brooklyn, New York, for 26 years. 1 year after Hearst's death, in 1952, they were purchased by two entrepreneurs for use as a tourist attraction. It took 19 months and the equivalent of nearly $20 million in today's currency to put the monastery back together. Hearst intended the monastery to be reassembled in California, but the bricks were held in Miami due to possible contamination of the packing material. They were later moved to and stored in New York, as Mr. Hearst had moved his attention to other ventures by that time. To move the building to the United States, each wall and structure was taken apart stone by stone, bound with a protective hay, and packed in more than 11,000 wooden crates. Unfortunately, while the crates were being shipped to America, a hoof and mouth disease epidemic broke out in Spain, and the United States Department of Agriculture was concerned that the protective hay carried the disease. To combat that problem, 23 men spent 3 months opening all of the boxes, sorting through 7 tons of nails, burning the hay, and then repacking the stones into the crates. While each crate was numbered for identification, when the stones were packed in Spain, the stones weren't repacked in the right boxes in America, and many were lost. To add insult to injury, Hearst soon faced financial problems that could only be remedied by selling most of the monastery in an auction. Whatever wasn't sold was left in a warehouse, and didn't come out again until 2 Miami businessmen, Will Edgemon and Raymond Moss, bought the monastery's remains in 1952 with plans to turn it into a tourist attraction, resulting in a project that Time magazine called the biggest jigsaw puzzle in history. In 1953, the final construction of the ancient Spanish monastery in Miami today took 19 months and nearly $20 million to complete. In 1964, Colonel Robert Pentland Jr., who was a multimillionaire banker, philanthropist, and benefactor of many Episcopal churches, purchased the cloisters and presented them to the Bishop of Florida. Today, the parish church of St. Bernard de Clairvaux is an active and growing congregation in the Episcopal Diocese of Southeast Florida. Services are held on Sundays and weekdays, in both English and Spanish. Hell is full of good wishes and desires. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Bernard of Clairvaux. Let us now learn about the man for which the church is named, St. Bernard de Clairvaux. According to the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, St. Bernard, 1090 to 1153, abbot of Clairvaux, one of the most illustrious preachers and monks of the Middle Ages, was born at Fontaines, near Dijon, in France. His father, a knight named Tesselin, perished on crusade, and his mother, Aeleth, a daughter of the noble house of Montbar, and a woman distinguished for her piety, died while Bernard was yet a boy. End quote. Bernard became a Cistercian monk around age 20, and even convinced about 30 other friends and family members to follow suit. He would become known as an ascetic, a philosopher, and most interestingly, a quote-unquote mystic. He would play a pivotal role in the reformation of the Benedictine order. Wikipedia has the following to say about St. Bernard de Clairvaux. Quote, Bernard helped found 163 monasteries in different parts of Europe. His influence led Alexander III to launch reforms that led to the establishment of canon law. He was canonized by Alexander III on 18th of January, 1174. He is labeled the mellifluous doctor for his eloquence. Cistercians honor him as one of the greatest early Cistercians. His feast day, observed in several denominations, is the 20th of August. Saint Bernard became known throughout Christendom for advocating the First and Second Crusades. Bernard is said to have swayed great leaders into action, boosted morale with his speeches, and even actively recruited thousands of troops himself, as his voice was likened to a, quote, celestial organ. Quote, James Meeker Ludlow, described the scene romantically in his book, The Age of Crusades. A large platform was erected on a hill outside the city. King and monk stood together, representing the combined will of earth and heaven. The enthusiasm of the assembly of Clermont in 1095, when Peter the Hermit and Urban II launched the First Crusade, was matched by the holy fervor inspired by Bernard as he cried, "O ye who listen to me, hasten to appease the anger of heaven, but no longer implore its goodness by vain complaints. Clothe yourselves in sackcloth, but also cover yourselves with your impenetrable bucklers. The din of arms, the danger, the labors, the fatigues of war, are the penances that God now imposes upon you. Hasten then to expiate your sins, by victories over the infidels, and let the deliverance of the holy places be the reward for your repentance." As in the olden scene, the cry, Deus vult, rolled over the fields, and was echoed by the voice of the orator, "Cursed be he who does not stain his sword with blood." When Bernard was finished, the crowd enlisted en masse. End quote. Bernard is Dante Alighieri's last guide in Divine Comedy. As he travels through the Empyrean, Dante's choice appears to be based on Bernard's contemplative mysticism, his devotion to Mary, and his reputation for eloquence. Speaking of devotion to Mary, Saint Bernard is typically depicted as actively receiving breast milk from the Virgin Mother herself. This motif was repeated dozens, if not hundreds of times in the classical depictions of Bernard.
It is said that Bernard's mother, Aleph, dedicated her son to God at the moment that he was born, and she had him educated at a chapter school of St. Paul's. Bernard was her third son, and while she was pregnant, she had a prophetic dream. In the dream, a white dog was barking constantly. She went to a holy man and asked him to decipher the dream, and he told her that the white dog was her son, and that he would be a marvellous preacher, that his tongue would heal through his words and would cure many of the evils that diseased man's soul. And that was from the Vita Primera, a book about Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard did indeed become a preacher, and like a guard dog he became a defender of the church against haters and its enemies. He was also a speaker and orator of sermons on the faith. He became regarded as a great teacher of the faith and was said to be filled with the Holy Spirit, which had been bestowed upon him at his birth. Though he was canonized on January the 18th, 1174, he was regarded by many as being controversial. He was involved in theological debates and conflicts with others such as Peter Abelard, whom he accused of heresy and condemned. And Bernard wrote a book about this titled The Errors of Abelard. He is most commonly known as the Abbot of Clairvaux and spiritual leader of the Cistercian order, and being involved in the formation of the Knights of the Temple of Solomon, who became known as the Templars. He was said to have had a variety of spiritual gifts, that he was involved with the building of monasteries in many places. He was respected for having looked after the interests of the church and for bringing sinners back to the spiritual path through his preaching and writing. He was regarded as a man of contemplation, who had a connection with the divine. Bernard preached to the people and not just to the monks. The people liked him, and he became popular as he talked to the laity about the glory of God. Bernard led an ascetic life known for his piety. The popes he was to serve venerated him for his good works for the church during the schisms that occurred, many of them during his lifetime. Bernard interpreted and clarified the scriptures for others, especially those who could not read. He had a thorough knowledge of the Bible and would explain God's will that was described in the more obscure parts of the book. He constantly thought about the Lord God and Christ, and taught that was the way of a monastic life, to contemplate on spiritual things constantly and to gain dialogue with God. There are 2 records of his life, written as a hagiography. They describe the miracles he had performed that deemed him worthy of sainthood, and all the holy deeds he had done, the writers often comparing him to characters from the Old Testament. The main book is the Vita Prima, which began to be written in 1147 by William of St. Thierry and continued by the Abbot Arnold of Bonneval. After his death, miracles happened at his burial site. For example, when Bernard lay in state, a boy with a withered arm touched where the abbot's body lay, and his withered arm was immediately healed. At the time of his death, Bernard was most known for being a major instigator in the rise of the Cistercian order. He had established monasteries for the Cistercian order, which he had joined in its early days, and the Cistercian order had been founded in 1098 by Robert of Molesey. Cistercian monks regarded Bernard as their spiritual leader, as he taught them how to live with the intention to be nearer to God. He wrote the Apology, which is a guidebook about the Cistercian lifestyle. At the monastery he did not live like the other monks, but lived in a little hovel, which he preferred because he was free from distraction and could dedicate himself to spiritual contemplation. He liked silence and solitude to help him, which aided in his approach to God. He wrote, "First of all, considering purifies the source from which it springs, i.e. the spirit. It also regulates our emotions, gives direction to our actions, corrects deviations, builds our character, bestows honour and order to our lives. To put it in one word, it provides knowledge of divine and human things." He had not been a good student as a child. He wrote about these times, "Trust my experience, one learns more from between the trees of the forest than in books." Many came to his monasteries to practice under him, including a young novice called Bernard Paginelli, who would go on to become Pope Eugenius III, whom Bernard was also advisor to. Bernard was a peacemaker who was able to sort out the troubles within the church as well as those between the European kings and the church authorities. Bernard was called up to help deal with many ecclesiastical matters, and he became known as the defender of the faith and the apostolic see. He found himself caught up in a couple of rebellions within the Holy See, as popes battled anti-popes, legitimate versus illegitimate, as the seat of Peter was fought over. He would also have to remind church leaders that their roles are to promote and be an example of the Lord's work with humility, piety, and not anger, war, and things like this. "Be an authority like Christ, not like Satan," he would say. He could see that many church leaders were working in contrary to the ways of the Christ, and he would petition the Pope to have such people removed from office. This caused contention and made him enemies, but he wanted a church that did as it preached, not archbishops and bishops who took advantage of their roles. "You are wrong if you think your apostolic power, which is supreme, is the only power instituted by God," Bernard wrote in a missive regarding the bishop's power going to their heads. He would remind them that there are other higher powers that can influence one, and the other higher powers can mislead, tempt one away from their religious rule. He reminded them to concentrate on attempting to reach the highest power. The responsibility one takes on as a priest, bishop, or whatever religious role should be respected. He noted that many worked in such an ungodly manner that he believed them to be the servants of the Antichrist. Bernard's father, Tesselin, was with Godfrey de Boulogne, who was the leader of the First Crusade into the Holy Lands. Tesselin was by Godfrey's side when he entered Jerusalem and won it for the Christian world. So from an early age, Bernard knew how important it was for the Christian leaders to have their place in this holy city. In 1129, at the Church Council of Troyes in Champagne, the Pope Honorius II made the Knights Templar an official order and put them under the guidance of Bernard. He helped with the defence of the Holy City and lands by drafting the rule for the Knights of the Temple of Solomon, the Templars. He also wrote in praise of the new militia about the order. But the Holy Lands did not stay in the Christian hands for long, And so Bernard promoted and preached for a second crusade, which was a failure, and again for a third crusade, which he was appointed leader at, Council of Chartres. But he replied, "Who am I to arrange armies in battle order, to lead forth armed men? I could think of nothing more remote from my calling." He would rather have used the word than the sword, as he states in a letter to the Pope, whom he reminds the Lord said, "Sheath your sword," in John 8:11. But he went on to explain that there are two swords, and this is written about in Luke 22:38. One is spiritual and the other material. The apostles said, "Behold, here we have two swords." These two swords can be wielded by the Pope as both belong to the Church, one spiritual, one material. The spiritual to be drawn by the Church, the Pope and the clergy, the material to be drawn for the Church by knights, warriors and soldiers. Bernard would explain that Christ can have two swords because he is both king and high priest, and so he has the right to wield a spiritual as well as a material sword. Bernard would not take any of the promotions offered to him, wanting to remain a monk and abbot of the monasteries he had set up. A monastic life, he believed, was the only way to eternal salvation, and you would attract many men to this way of life, which is why he became known as a fisherman in God's service.
What Bernard is perhaps best known for, however, is being the founder of the Knights Templar. For those unfamiliar with the Knights Templar, we will read from Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, "Templar, also called Knight Templar, member of the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a religious military order of knighthood established at the time of the Crusades that became a model and inspiration for other military orders. Originally founded to protect Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land, the order assumed greater military duties during the 12th century. Its prominence and growing wealth, however, provoked opposition from rival orders. Falsely accused of blasphemy and blamed for Crusader failures in the Holy Land, the order was destroyed by King Philip IV of France. The rule of the order was modeled after the Benedictine rule, especially as understood and implemented by the Cistercians. The Knights Templar swore an oath of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and renounced the world, just as the Cistercians and other monks did. Like the monks, the Templars heard the divine office during each of the canonical hours of the day, and were expected to honor the fasts and vigils of the monastic calendar. They were frequently found in prayer and expressed particular veneration to the Virgin Mary. They were not allowed to gamble, swear, or become drunk, and were required to live in community, sleeping in a common dormitory and eating meals together. They were not, however, strictly cloistered, as were the monks, nor were they expected to perform devotional reading. Most Templars were uneducated and unable to read Latin. The knights' primary duty was to fight. The Templars gradually expanded their duties, from protecting the pilgrims to mounting a border defense of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. They built castles, garrisoned important towns, and participated in battles, fielding significant contingents against Muslim armies until the fall of Acre, the last remaining Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, in 1291. Their effectiveness was attested by the Sultan Saladin following the devastating defeat of Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin. He bought the Templars who were taken prisoner and later had each of them executed. The Templars eventually acquired great wealth. The kings and great nobles of Spain, France, and England gave lordships, castles, seigneuries, and estates to the order, so that by the mid-12th century, the Templars owned properties scattered throughout Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Holy Land. The Templars' military strength enabled them to safely collect, store, and transport bullion to and from Europe and the Holy Land, and their network of treasure storehouses and their efficient transport organization made them attractive as bankers to kings as well as to pilgrims to the Holy Land. The Templars were not without enemies, however. They had long engaged in a bitter rivalry with the other great military order of Europe, the Hospitallers. and by the late 13th century, proposals were being made to merge the two contentious orders into one. The fall of Acre to the Muslims in 1291 removed much of the Templars' reason for being, and their great wealth, extensive land holdings in Europe, and power inspired resentment toward them. Although an ex-Templar had accused the order of blasphemy and immorality as early as 1304, though more likely 1305, it was only later, after Philip IV ordered the arrest on October 13, 1307, of every Templar in France, and sequestered all of the Templars' property in the country, that most of the people of Europe became aware of the extent of the alleged crimes of the order. Philip accused the Templars of heresy and immorality. Specific charges against them included idol worship, of a bearded male head said to have great powers, worship of a cat, worship of a cat, homosexuality, and numerous other errors of belief and practice. At the order's secret initiation rite, it was claimed the new member denied Christ 3 times, spat on the crucifix, and was kissed on the base of the spine, on the navel, and on the mouth by the knight presiding over the ceremony. The charges, now recognized to be without foundation, were calculated to stoke contemporary fears of heretics, witches, and demons, and were similar to allegations Philip had used against Pope Boniface VIII.
First, my family in the form of St. Bernard started the Knights Templars. And then the Knights Templars were attacked in France by Philip the Fair and the Pope. And half the Knights Templars went into Scotland and the other half went up into Switzerland. And that's how my family went up into Switzerland. This is a Templar sword or a Masonic sword. Democracy wasn't won by a prayer. They had to get rid of a lot of bad people. And a lot of battles were fought. It took 200 years for my family to bring democracy to the Swiss. My family in Switzerland in the 12, 13, and 1400s went broke arming the peasants and providing military aid to the peasants and teaching the peasants how to fight the Pope and the Emperor. They were fighting the Pope and the Emperor basically because the Pope and the Emperor were corrupt. My family was righteous and wanted the righteousness to be extended down to the people.
The reasons why Philip sought to destroy the Templars are unclear. He may have genuinely feared their power and been motivated by his own piety to destroy a heretical group. Or he may have simply seen an opportunity to seize their immense wealth, being chronically short of money himself. At any rate, Philip mercilessly pursued the order and had many of its members tortured to secure false confessions. Although Pope Clement V, himself a Frenchman, ordered the arrest of all the Templars in 1307, a church council in 1311 voted overwhelmingly against suppression, and Templars in countries other than France were found innocent of the charges. Clement, however, under strong pressure from Philip, suppressed the order on March 22, 1312, and the Templars' property throughout Europe was transferred to the Hospitallers or confiscated by secular rulers. Knights who confessed and were reconciled to the church were sent into retirement in the order's former houses or in monasteries, but those who failed to confess or who relapsed were put on trial. Among those judged guilty was the order's last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. Brought before a commission established by the Pope, de Molay and other leaders were judged relapsed heretics and sentenced to life in prison. The master protested and repudiated his confession and was burned at the stake, the last victim of a highly unjust and opportunistic persecution. At the time of its destruction, the order was an important institution in both Europe and the Holy Land, and already an object of myth and legend. The Templars were associated with the Grail legend, and were identified as defenders of the Grail castle through the remainder of the Middle Ages. In the 18th century, the Freemasons claimed to have received in a secret line of succession esoteric knowledge that the Templars had possessed. Later fraternal orders similarly invoked the Templars' name to bolster claims of ancient or revealed wisdom. The Templars were also identified as Gnostics and were accused of involvement in a number of conspiracies, including one that was allegedly behind the French Revolution. One often cited, but likely apocryphal account, relates that, after the execution of Louis XVI, a French Freemason dipped a cloth in the slain king's blood and cried out, "Jacques de Molay, you are avenged." In the 20th century, the image of Christ on the Shroud of Turin was identified as the head allegedly worshipped by the Templars, resurrecting a vein of pseudo-history and Grail legends. Authors in the 20th century, claiming to assert historical fact, but writing what most scholars regard as fantasy, implicated the Templars in a vast conspiracy dedicated to preserving the bloodline of Jesus. Similar occult conspiracy theories were also used by writers of fiction in the 20th and 21st centuries. End quote.
What I know of the divine science and holy scripture, I learnt in the woods and fields. I have no other masters than the beeches, oaks, and vines. Bernard of Clairvaux.
Let us now discuss William Randolph Hearst. The following is taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Quote, William Randolph Hearst, born April 29, 1863, San Francisco, California. Died August 14, 1951, Beverly Hills, California. American newspaper publisher who built up the nation's largest newspaper chain and whose methods profoundly influenced American journalism. Hearst was the only son of George Hearst, a gold mine owner and U.S. Senator from California, 1886 to 1891. The young Hearst attended Harvard College for 2 years before being expelled for antics ranging from sponsoring massive beer parties in Harvard Square to sending chamber pots to his professors. Their images were depicted within the bowls. In 1887, he took control of the struggling San Francisco Examiner, which his father had bought in 1880 for political reasons. Hearst remade the paper into a blend of reformist investigative reporting and lurid sensationalism. Within 2 years, it was showing a profit. He then entered the New York City newspaper market in 1895 by purchasing the theretofore unsuccessful New York Morning Journal. The New York Journal soon attained an unprecedented circulation as a result of its use of many illustrations, color magazine sections, and glaring headlines. Its sensational articles on crime and pseudoscientific topics, its bellicosity in foreign affairs, its reduced price of 1 cent. Hearst's Journal and Pulitzer's World became involved in a series of fierce circulation wars, and these newspapers' use of sensationalistic reporting and frenzied promotional schemes brought New York City journalism to a boil. Competition between the two papers, including rival Yellow Kid cartoons, soon gave rise to the term yellow journalism. The journal excoriated Great Britain in the Venezuela-British Guiana border dispute from 1895, and then demanded, between 1897 and 98, war between the United States and Spain. Through dishonest and exaggerated reportage, Hearst's newspapers whipped up public sentiment against Spain so much that they actually helped cause the Spanish-American War of 1898. Hearst supported William Jennings Bryan in the presidential campaign of 1896 and again in 1900, when he assailed President William McKinley as a tool of the trusts, the biggest companies in the United States. While serving rather inactively in the U.S. House of Representatives between 1903 and 1907, Hearst received considerable support for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1904 and, running on an anti-Tammany Hall ticket, came within 3,000 votes of winning the 1905 election for mayor of New York City. In 1906, he lost Charles Evans Hughes in the election for governor of New York, and in 1909 he suffered a worse defeat in the New York City mayoral election. Rebuffed in his political ambitions, Hearst continued to vilify the British Empire, opposed U.S. entry into World War I, and maligned the League of Nations and the World Court. By 1925, Hearst had established or acquired newspapers in every section of the United States, as well as several magazines. He also published books of fiction and produced motion pictures featuring the actress Marion Davies, his mistress for more than 30 years. In the 1920s, he built a grandiose castle on a 240,000-acre ranch in San Simon, California, and he furnished this residential complex with a vast collection of antiques and art objects that he had bought in Europe." End quote. In 1929, Hearst sponsored the alleged first ever round-the-world voyage in an airship. This was not just any airship, however. It was the infamous Graf Zeppelin, with its National Socialist insignia. This Zeppelin would frequently dock, or rather, moor, at the Opa-locka skyport, a city known for its Moorish architecture. Opa-locka is a Seminole word. When we analyze the flag of the Florida Seminole tribe, we find it nearly identical to the flag of Germany. It should not surprise us that both National Socialist aircraft and submarines frequented the area. Speaking of getting high, it was in the 1930s that Hearst became the driving force behind the most malicious propaganda war ever waged against the American public, and thus the criminalization of cannabis. Quote, "At the peak of his fortune, in 1935, he owned 28 major newspapers and 18 magazines, along with several radio stations, movie companies, and news services. But his vast personal extravagances and the Great Depression of the 1930s soon seriously weakened his financial position, and he had to sell faltering newspapers or consolidate them with stronger units. In 1937, he was forced to begin selling off some of his art collection, and by 1940, he had lost personal control of the vast communications empire that he had built. He lived the last years of his life in virtual seclusion. Hearst's life was the basis for the 1941 movie Citizen Kane.
The opening night of Citizen Kane in San Francisco, and I found myself going to the top of the mark in the elevator with Mr. Hearst, and I introduced myself. This strange dinosaur, you know, he had ice-cold blue eyes and had a very high unicoid voice like that. And I said, Mr. Hearst, I didn't bother him with my father or any of that. I just said, I have some good tickets for the opening of Citizen Kane. Would you like to come? And he didn't answer. And I got off the elevator, thinking, as I still do, that if he had been Charles Foster Kane, he would have taken the tickets and gone.
At the beginning of the 21st century, the family-owned Hearst Corporation was still one of the largest media companies in the United States, with interests in newspapers, magazines, broadcasting, financial and medical services, and cartoon and feature syndicates." End quote. Strangely enough, a separate portion of the same monastery, Abbey of Clairvaux, was also allegedly reassembled only a stone's throw away in the Bahamas. This complex is known as the Bahamas Cloisters. We will now read from Wikipedia. Quote, "The French cloister is situated in the northern Bahamas on Paradise Island. It is from a 14th century Augustinian monastery, dismantled and imported from Europe by William Randolph Hearst. Purchased while still in pieces from Hearst's estate by Huntington Hartford and reassembled stone by stone here as the centerpiece of the Versailles Gardens on Paradise Island, overlooks Nassau Harbor to one side and the one and only Ocean Club Resort to the other." Let us now read from travelandleisure.com. Quote, "But," says Conway, "it's not until you reach the cloisters that you see the full grandeur of Hartford's project. The structure looks, eerily, like it has been in this spot all along, but this is actually an amalgam of marble pieces from two sets of cloisters, some built by the Augustinians in 12th and 13th century France, others salvaged from a Cistercian monastery in Spain. Their exact provenance is still a question, one that has been investigated by several scholars over the years, most recently with the support of the Department of Medieval Art at the Met Museum. Both were purchased by William Randolph Hearst in the 1920s and promptly mixed together as a result of confusion at U.S. Customs. A few errant pieces were likely carved in more modern times. The pieces languished in storage, changing hands many times before Hartford acquired them in 1961, commissioning architect J.J. Castromon to reconstruct them as the crowning jewel of his 35-acre estate." End quote. How amazing is it that the pair of structures would end up so close together after such a distance traveled and time elapsed. O sacred head now wounded, with grief and shame weighed down, now scornfully surrounded, with thorns thine only crown. A sacred head, what glory, what bliss till now was thine, yet though despised in glory, I joy to call thee mine. Be thou my consolation, my shield when I must die. Remind me of thy passion, when my last hour draws nigh. Mine eyes shall then behold thee, upon thy cross shall dwell. My heart by faith enfolds thee, who dieth thus die well. Bernard of Clairvaux.